All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome and hello to today's webinar from WGBH. This is a webinar on science for social justice, researching and designing a framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion in K-12 science educational media. My name is Pegeen Wright, and I'm the Director of Digital Learning at GBH Education and the current project lead for our science activation project, Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom. I know I've met many of you and I'm familiar with some of your projects, but I welcome you and hope you get what you need out of today's session. Feel free to type in the chat. Is everybody familiar with where the chat is? I think I saw a question. But if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. And at the end, we will open up the mics to take questions as well. Okay, so next slide, please. So the agenda for today is as noted. I'll begin by discussing our charge for this work from Kristen Erickson, our program officer at NASA. And then my colleagues will present the work, a framework for diversity and equity in K-12 science and the development of educational media for science, and our design principles that we've established through this work. And then we'll end with a Q&A session with my colleagues on this project, Dr. April Bo Wang from GBH and Dr. Blakely Tsurusaki, who has been our lead consultant on this from the University of Washington. Next slide, please. So our charge for this aspect of our project work, many of you know Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom is a collection of over 200 K-12 digital learning resources on PBS Learning Media, a free educational network from the PBS system. And but our charge for this specific aspect of our work was to research and design this framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the goal for us is to figure out how to promote culturally and linguistically responsive science teaching and learning with insights for both inside and outside of the classroom. The next slide, please. So over the past 5 years, Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom has committed to supporting diverse learners. It has been, from day one of the project, it has been an important goal of ours. We originally targeted 2 subgroups of diverse learners, and those include students with disabilities using assistive technologies and English learners. In year 5, we were charged with exploring the issues of diversity and equity as well, and this presentation will describe our work in that area. But what you're seeing on the screen now is one example of one of our interactive lessons, which both the platform and the editorial work we have modified as we've gone through the 5 years based on a lot of teacher input and classroom research to make it more usable and appropriate for diverse students. Next slide, please. So this work included ensuring our these student-directed lessons were available with audio language support, now in both English and Spanish. And we worked with our English language learner teacher advisory council to produce and test printable support materials to accompany our resources for supporting English learners. Next slide, please. Our charge for year 5 of the project included conducting a Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, baseline review of our resources. And we were able to implement some of the findings, had hoped to implement the full findings in years 6 through 10, but unfortunately our project was not renewed. And as many of you know, we also provided extensive UDL support to the SciAC community at large. We conducted 3 webinars earlier this year for the SciAC team, and then we conducted 3 educator webinars that reached more than 1,000 teachers using UDL to assist them in teaching science in a distance learning environment. Our year 5 work, next slide please, also included exploring ways to ensure the media that we produce in the future is culturally and linguistically responsive. As most of you know, there's been an emphasis on culturally responsive teaching over the past decade, with the idea that when we respect students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds in the classroom, they are better able to learn and see themselves succeeding academically. So we think about culturally and linguistically responsive education. We usually think about the humanities subjects, including diverse texts, for example, in English language arts classrooms, or incorporating diverse perspectives in history classrooms. But while we like to think about science as neutral, it is in actuality as influenced by historical and societal and personal biases as any subject. So to ensure that we are supporting the diversity of students in our country, we decided to develop this framework for diversity and equity in science educational media. The framework was meant to review the strengths of BUAC resources, our Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom resources, as well as the opportunities to improve them, to inform how we can improve them over time so that they're more culturally and linguistically responsive in the future. So while this framework that we developed is primarily meant for media producers, we also see it as being very useful for program designers and teachers in the selection of media to incorporate in their programs and classrooms. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. April Bo Wang of WGBH, and she led this project from the WGBH side. April?
Great. Next slide. Thanks so much, Peggy. So this is, we're going to dive into the framework for diversity and equity in K-12 science educational media. And I'd like to begin by Ethan, next slide. Introducing the advisory group. So this work has been driven by an advisory group, which we selected to ensure representative expertise in science identity, Indigenous ways of knowing, expertise working with English learners, pre-K-12 education, curriculum, pedagogy, and professional development, both inside classrooms and in out-of-school time settings. So we have Mariana Athede from Lowell Public Schools. She's also an educator ambassador with GBH and a rock star science teacher. Edna Tan from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Christopher Wright from Drexel University, Felicia Mensa from Teachers College. Next slide. Megan Bang, who's currently at the Spencer Foundation, but sits at Northwestern University. Carrie Zhao from the University of Washington, Bothwell. Brian Count-Wallace, who I think the SciAct group has heard from before, from Fisk University. Anne Roseberry, formerly of Turk, and next slide. Our advisory group leader and key consultant, Blakely Tsurusaki, who I am going to pass this over to in a bit. Dr. Tsurusaki, who we've had the great pleasure of working with, is a faculty member and senior research scientist in the School of Educational Studies and the Good Lad Institute for Educational Renewal at the University of Washington, Bothwell. She has expertise in curriculum development, professional development, culturally relevant teaching, and environmental education, and has had experience teaching both formal and informal K-12 STEM education. Prior to her position at UWB, she was a STEM director for a nonprofit that provided professional development for STEM K-12 teachers, university faculty, and STEM professionals. Also, she's just a delight to work with and an incredibly thoughtful human being. So it's been a pleasure. All right, so I am going to turn it over to Blakely to talk through the framework.
Thanks, April. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the framework that we've been working on this past year actually consists of 5 parts. So the first part was really to dive into the research and look at what the research says, both specifically in science education and also in education in general, and what it says around diversity and equity. So that was the first piece of this work. And then the next piece of the work in part 2 was to really look at practices in work that people have done that have been shown to support diversity and equity in K-12 science education. So that was part 2. And then after that, we reviewed some media resources, and these were not BUAC or Bringing the Universe into America's Classrooms resources, there were other resources that we were looking to that were strong in some aspects of diversity and equity. And the purpose of this was to really look at resources that had done different aspects well, to be able to draw on that for the framework that we were developing. So then that leads us to part 4, which is our design principles for K-12 science educational media. And we'll spend some time talking about that in this presentation. And then I also did a summary, then I also reviewed some of the BUAC resources using the design principles for K-12 educational media to review those and look both for their strengths and then opportunities for improvement. And then, those are included in the appendix of the report, but then in part 5, what I did was create a summary of the baseline review of those resources. So the highlights from the first part of this project was really to do this summary, to dive into the research and what the research says about diversity and equity in science education and education in general. And so the themes that I explored were really themes that were brought up from our advisor group. And so April introduced the people that were part of our advisor group. And so from those meetings with the advisory group, we came up with these 4 themes that were really central to diversity and equity. So the first theme was this idea about really making sure to take an anti-deficit perspective. And this is an overarching principle for the whole work that we were doing. So the idea that we really should be focusing on the strengths of students and communities rather than looking at deficits or things that need to be made up in education, but really acknowledging that students have a lot of strengths and things that sometimes aren't recognized in education, whether it's formal or informal education. And we really need to start where students are at and build on that. The second theme was thinking about representation. So in this category, it's really thinking about people representation. And so we know that role models are really important in education and for people seeing themselves as people that potentially are interested in science or STEM, and that's a really important part of that. So making sure that we are thinking about increasing representation, particularly those from minoritized groups, such as African Americans, Hispanics, Latinx, and Indigenous groups, which are underrepresented in STEM fields, as well as those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, females, and English learners. So that was the second category, is digging into the research around that. The third category was really thinking about science representation. So we know that the science students often learn is presented from a very narrow view of science. So it's often presented from a very Western perspective. We know that schooling in K-12 education is often developed from a dominant white middle class perspective. And we have a lot of historical and systemic inequities in our systems. So really we need to think about how we expand ideas of science beyond Western science to include other sciences such as Indigenous sciences, and really acknowledge the assets that come from different communities and how they contribute to science. The final category was thinking about access and engagement. And so it's really important to be able to broaden opportunities and access and engagement for all students. And so how can we help students and teachers connect to and privilege students' everyday lives in science? And another piece of that is really paying attention to the academic language of science, because we know that the academic language of science can be like speaking another language to a lot of students. And so it's really important to think about how we are bringing them into the practices and the language of science. So that's included under the access and engagement. So these were the 4 those were the 4 categories, and they're obviously intertwined, and so they're connected. So you'll see that obviously there are connections between them as we talk about these things. So the highlights from the second part of this work was a summary of the best practices. And so you'll see we've narrowed this down to the 3 categories because really thinking about the anti-deficit perspective is an overarching perspective that encompasses these 3 themes. And so what we did was we looked at some best practices from the literature around the representation. So who does science? And so can students see themselves reflected in media resources? The science representation, which is really about what is science. And so that's really about media resources that can show the diverse processes and practices of science. Media resources should show ways of doing science that include the cultural and historical nature of science that we sometimes don't see as much. The media resources should prompt students, oops, I apologize, my doggies are barking, with opportunities to actually engage in science practice. So that's a shift that we've seen over the last number of years, also with the next generation science standards, and really getting students to engage in science to learn science. In terms of the access engagement, really thinking about considering the place and the context of the learners, and really situating it from and building on where their own experiences. And I apologize. And so media resources providing context for why students should be learning about phenomena and why they're relevant to their lives. Another important piece is really thinking about the communities that you're working with and involving them in the process of developing your resources, whether it's media or any type of curriculum. And then the final piece of that, again, is related to the academic language. And so we know that it's really difficult for students to understand new words and ways of talking about things without actually experiencing them. So really providing students with experiences that they can then connect the language to.
Great, next slide. And so in this next part of the presentation, we're going to dive more deeply into the design principles. And as Pegeen said, while we mean for these principles to help media producers produce culturally and linguistically responsive science media, we also see them as a helpful guidance for educators to select media for their classrooms and programs. And Blakely is going to introduce the 3 tenets of the design principles, and you'll see that they reflect a lot of the themes that we've already talked about, and so there's a lot of alignment. And then she and I are going to do a little bit of an interview. So I know this is a lot of information, and we're going to talk about 4 example resources to really illustrate the themes that we've been talking about. Next slide.
Yeah, so this next section, we're actually going to dive into the design principles for diversity and equity in science educational media. So like we said, in this diagram, you can see that the anti-diff perspective is really encompassing of these themes here. So that's why you see that in the circle in the middle. And then we'll talk about the representation in terms of who does science, representation in terms of what is science, and then that access and engagement.
Great, so let's go to our first resource. All right, so the first resource, we're going to explore that first tenet, design principle, who does science, and generally resources that exemplify this kind of representation, represent people from different backgrounds, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English learners. They represent people with a variety of interests and values and also cultural practices. They also include the contributions and the historical contributions and current that minoritized people and communities have made and are making currently in science. So this resource that is displayed right now, seasonal temperature and precipitation variations, is a resource in the Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom, and it includes an interactive lesson in which students gather evidence to construct an explanation to answer, how does weather change with the seasons? So Blakely, how do you see this resource highlighting representation of who does science?
So the first thing I actually want to say about this is that it's pretty common just across, not just BUAC resources, but just across science education resources in general, to not see representation of people in curriculum materials, unless it's a video that has actual people that are playing a role in it. And so in this case, what we see here in this resource is on this first page, you can see that they actually have an example of a clip of a woman who's Black, who is giving the weather or giving a weather report. So just even that small piece is really important for people to see people that are non-white in it, that are part of the curriculum.
And how can this resource better? So knowing that it is really hard, how can this resource, what are some suggestions you have for better representing who does science?
Yeah, so I think just bringing people in, and so that students, oftentimes when we teach kids about science, they're doing things like collecting data or whatnot, or learning about data that's existing or phenomenon or whatnot, but they're not actually learning and thinking about the people who are actually doing this. So it's really important to bring in the people, and that there are people that are doing this work, and to have broad representation of that. So even in here, there's this one clip in the beginning, but if there could be other examples in this about other people who are doing the science and examples, that would be really great. Another thing about this is, positioning the students really as scientists and seeing themselves as people who are doing the science. So sometimes we ask students to do the work, but we don't actually explicitly position them as scientists, as, okay, this is what scientists do, you're going to do something similar to what scientists are doing. So they can start to see themselves as capable people who can be scientists.
Thank you. And can we move to the next resource? Great, so the next two resources, and this is the first of them, is exploring representation of what is science. So resources that represents what is science in a diverse and equitable way, show the different motivations behind processes and underlying biases of science, which Blakely talked about. They offer opportunities for students to draw upon individual and community resources to engage in the practices of science. And they also address the relationship between science and society, that might be societal implications of science, or the societal processes or purposes behind science. So in this resource, Eclipse Over America, Predicting Eclipses, this video resource allows students to learn how Edmund Halley used mathematics to predict the time and path of the 1715 total solar eclipse. So Blakely, again, how do you see this resource highlighting representation of what is science?
Yeah, and so, sorry, I want to back up 1 second because I forgot to mention something about who does science, which is also connected to this what is science part. So the other important part about thinking about who does science is because we all bring in our different perspectives and things that we care about. That actually influences what science is done and how we do the science. So that's another important aspect of thinking about who does science and thinking about the communities that it gets done and the purposes for doing science, which then is connected to this what is science part. So that's another reason why it's so important to have representation of various people from different communities and backgrounds. So then in thinking about the connection to what is science, the really nice thing about these, it actually contains these two video clips, is they actually show kind of how the science takes place in different contexts historically and culturally. So they talk about why people were actually studying eclipses and what it meant to their communities, which was really important for then people to understand how science takes place in the context of culture and community.
And then just because I saw a question pop up and it kind of relates to the communities who have done science, one of the questions in the chat box was whether anybody have a handy example of a major contribution from Indigenous science? And not to put you on the spot, but I know you have some examples of that in the framework.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of examples. Oh, and I just saw someone said, oh, Sita just put resources from Megan Bang. So Megan was on our advisor group, and she also works with Carrie Zoe, who's one of my colleagues, and they've been doing a lot of work around learning in places. And so thinking about how Indigenous perspectives about how we are connected and part of our environment, and thinking about ourselves as part of our ecological systems instead of positioned as outside. So those perspectives have really influenced how we think about ecosystems and interactions in ecosystems. There's also another specific example from Megan's work was thinking about, I'm gonna say the animals incorrectly. Was it coyotes and badgers? April, are you going to correct me? Where they had researchers who were studying the hunting behaviors of these two animals. And from their perspective, they thought that they were competing for resources, but indigenous researchers saw that as they were collaborating or supporting each other in this hunting behaviors, which was actually what the case was when they dived into and did more research, was that it actually was a mutually beneficial relationship rather than a competition. So just those different perspectives. There's also examples of birds who have started fires to help with both regeneration of forests and fire containment. There's a lot of stuff around climate change where indigenous knowledge has been really central in understanding how climate change has affected environments.
Thank you. And then going back to this resource, how could this resource, what else would you do to improve the representation of what is science in this resource?
Oh, sorry, can you say it one more time? I was looking at the chat comment.
Going back to the Eclipse Over America Predicting Eclipses resource, what other things might you recommend for a resource producer or a teacher who wants to contextualize this, to emphasize what is science?
Yeah, so as part of the resources, as part of these BUAC resources, there's not just the videos, but they also include a lot of supplemental materials as well, or resources that teachers can use as they're teaching this. So they include things like teaching tips, and some of them have lesson plans, and they all have background information that's really important to understanding the purpose of these materials. So some of this can happen not necessarily in the media clip itself, but in some of those supplemental resources. So for example, in the teaching tips or in the lesson plans, making sure to include information about like questioning students about their understanding about what's going on, about their experiences with eclipses, thinking about how it connects to their lives. So really making those connections between their own experiences and then what they've been seeing. And also being able to talk about things that come up in these videos that talk about, well, how do eclipses affect these cultures? Like, why were scientists or people in those times really interested in studying eclipses? And then thinking about like, okay, well, why do researchers or scientists now, why are they interested in studying eclipses? Like, what does that tell us about how it impacts the science now?
Great. Let's move on to our next example. So the last two examples had a video as a media resource, and this one continues to think about representation, what is science. This digital model from the astronomy education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln allows students to explore observable moon patterns to motions within the Earth, Sun, Moon system. So Blakely, how do you see this kind of resource highlighting representation of what is science, since it's not a narrative video structure?
Yeah, so one of the huge benefits of media resources is you can do some things that you normally might not be able to do otherwise in the amount of time that you have in the classroom. So when you do, oftentimes you'll do moon observations or whatnot, and you'll do it over the course of a month. And then you can do some work with that. And so the nice thing about something like this is that you can actually spend some time in class and then think about how the moon changes, or not the actual moon itself, but what we see changes in a shorter time period. And then you can really use this model to help you ask questions about how that happens and why, and investigate it. So that's something really nice about something like a model. And then you can talk about things like, okay, why, again, like, why are we studying this? Why do we care about, you know, studying the moon and the phases of the moon, or different phenomena like that? And then you can also then combine that with things like, you know, observing the moon and the phases of the moon, like in your students' lives, and have them do those things like collect observations over a longer period of time.
Great, and you're already kind of getting into that a little bit, but you know my next question is going to be, what else could you do with this resource? Or if you were a teacher incorporating it into your program, how else could you add contextualization to focus more on the diversity behind what science is?
Yeah, so definitely an important thing that we know, and this is obviously connected to the access and engagement, is making it really relevant to students' lives. And so talking about what our observations that we make, why it's important, the processes of why people study the moon, how they study the moon. This is an example of using a model to investigate questions. So being able to talk about it as a model and talk about the assumptions that go into the model. You know, you can discuss like, why was this model developed from this particular perspective? And just kind of the benefits and drawbacks of models, and that we know that models are imperfect, but why we use them and why we make certain decisions about how we create our models and use our models. Something that we could do, if you notice in this model, in the background on the top part where it shows these houses with the kind of white picket fence, and they're kind of these single family homes and whatnot. A way to improve this and thinking about just even the background is, what are you representing when you're showing this depiction of a place where people live? And so you, like I said, this has white picket fences, and it has this, it looks like a playground with some swings. And so including more representation there. So just including things like apartment buildings or factories or other things to make it a little less like a kind of suburban experience is a way that this could be improved.
And then I just wanted to go back to your comment about talking about why the model was developed from a particular perspective. And I think when we talked about this resource, you were also speaking about the orientation of north, south, east, and west. Can you talk a little bit about like developing models from perspective and what you mean?
Yeah, so actually, and I don't know if Sean also wants to jump in. I think she's on this. Too, because so I will say studying the moon is not my area of expertise. And so I actually had a conversation with Sean about this, Sean Stevens, who's a co-PI on this project, about kind of this model and the orientation of things and the perspective that we're looking at. And so if you look at this, you see the person standing on the earth. And then you see like the orientation on the top graphic, which goes from east to west, which to me, when I first saw it, was counterintuitive, because if I think about looking at a map, when I look at a map straightforward, I think about north being on top, which is in this, and south being on the bottom, but then west being on the left-hand side, and in this it's on the other side. So having discussions about that and how it's represented and how it was kind of determined to orient things in particular ways.
Thank you.
Not to put Shannon on the spot, but I don't know if she wants to say anything.
Oh, I think she might be muted right now until the end, and then she can share lots of wisdom.
Yes, she knows way more than I do about this.
But let's move on to the last resource, and then we're getting close to that question and answer portion. All right, so the last overarching design principle is access and engagement. And so when we're thinking about what resources do access engagement well, there are resources that provide examples that are relevant to students' lives, which again has been a recurring theme in those other two principles as well, building on students and communities' experiences, showing multiple examples of how phenomena occur in different contexts and why, providing multiple ways for students to engage with materials and multiple ways to demonstrate understanding, and then onboarding students to the academic language of science that Blakely talked about. So in looking at this resource, 30 Sunset, Summer to Winter, this is a time-lapse video with other supporting materials, and it lets students explore the apparent movement of the sun along the horizon as it sets at different times of the year. So when you're thinking about access engagement, what is this resource doing it's doing well, likely?
Yeah, so this is another example of where media can be really powerful and provide students with some opportunities to learn some things that are otherwise, again, might take a lot longer, might be harder to visualize because you might be collecting data over long periods of time, so you might not be able to compare it directly like you can in this time-lapse video. So that's a really nice thing that this video actually allows you to do, is it shows the sunrise and sunset over a period of time, so you can actually see how it changes over time. So another nice thing about having this video is that you can actually slow down and speed up the time on this video. So if you want to spend some more time to be able to really think about it and observe the patterns that you see, it might be easier for some students or others to either slow it down or speed it up. And you can kind of flip back to different time parts if you need to. It also has, again, so a really nice thing about the Bo Wang resources is it not only has these video or these media components, but it also has lesson plans or teaching tips or whatnot to support them. And so another thing that it suggests doing along with watching these or watching the time-lapse video is actually having students collect their own data too, so that they can then think about what happens in their context versus this example, because this example actually takes place in the Northwest. And so if we think about context, it might be very different than people, actually living in the Northwest in Seattle. And so we have a very different length of daylight in our summers versus our winters, where right now it's getting dark at 4 o'clock. And so, which might be very different from other parts of the country or the world, where you don't see that big of a difference between sunrise and sunset from different times of the year. So being able to make those connections between this video and then what happens in their own context.
And then how about what things we could do as a teacher or a media producer to make this even more accessible and engaging?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously it would take more resources to be able to do this, but, providing potentially more than one example so that students can see and think about how it takes, or how this phenomena is different in different parts of the world. And so it's not the same, everyone doesn't experience this the same. So maybe being able to provide more examples of that would be really great. But again, that's going to take some more resources to be able to do that. Sorry, and then another thing that's just important in thinking about access and engagement in general, so both relates to this resource as well as just resources in general, is really providing students with multiple ways to both access phenomena materials. So like visually and through discussion and talking about it, and actually being able to do activities, personally do activities. And then also in how they're able to demonstrate their understanding. So thinking about doing that through talk, thinking about doing that through being able to do that through writing, thinking about being able to do it through things like drawing as well, and building that into the actual resources and saying, here are multiple ways that you can explain or demonstrate what you understand about these things.
Great. And then my last question is, you already talked about it a little bit for this resource, but just in generally, because you, to that point on the third bullet about how phenomena occurs in different contexts and why, I know you've written a lot about place-based education and the importance of considering place. Like, how would you think more about that in science resources in general?
Yeah, I mean, so we know from the research that students are more engaged when it's something that's relevant to them and something that they can actually think about their own experiences with something and then use that as a starting point for building on that understanding and knowledge and experiences. So that's why it's really important to think about the context of place. And so, for example, in this time-lapse video, if you're in a place that's not in the Northwest, you could just start with your own students' context and talk to them about, okay, what are your experiences with when the sun rises and sun sets? What have you experienced? And talk about why people study it. Why should we care about this? Because we know if you start from those places, it's more engaging to students because they can start to think about their own experiences and be able to have something to draw on and make connections to. It's just more engaging for them. And then you could get into this, okay, here's an example of sunrise and sunset, and then be able to think about, okay, how does this compare to our own experiences? How is it different? How does that affect our lives? Because you can also make connections to obviously why scientists study it, but then how it affects things in our communities. There's a lot of connections to things like agriculture, and just even, you know, talking to kids about what happens when it's winter and it gets dark earlier. How does that change kind of just what you do in your lives? Like, do you spend as much time outside in the dark or whatnot? And those things, to really make those connections.
Thank you. And I see that Mark has asked, has expressed the wish that someone could critique his websites from this perspective. So thank you so much, Blakely. We're going to move to the question and answer portion that Pegeen will be facilitating.
Terrific, thank you so much. And I see that we've had a lot of questions in the chat box, and I know we've addressed some of them, and thankfully members of the participants on the webinar have done a great job in addressing some of these as well. But are there specific questions? I should tell you that this report will be available. We will post it in SMD EPO by the end of December. And so you'll have access to it. It's a fairly lengthy report, but the design guidelines are part of that, the design principles. So those will be available for you, and we would love any feedback that you may have. But let me open it up to see if we have questions for either Blakely or April, or even Sean Stevens, who's our curriculum director. And as Ethan says, who's behind the scenes, as usual, doing a great job, that you can unmute yourselves if you want to. No questions?
Hey, this is Randy Neff.
Hi, Randy.
I just have one question about the whole idea of science, what it is, and the different perspectives that people bring to a discipline when they are investigating. I mean, I'm familiar with, I'm a biologist, so I know that more women in biology has focused more on, you know, like female choice and evolutionary perspectives. But I'm curious if there are resources that maybe have looked into what people bring, the questions or motivations and whatnot that they bring with them when they engage with science. So I'm not sure where to go and find things like that. I'm working on a lesson on climate science, and you know, it's a huge thing in different kinds of climate models. And so I'm just wondering if there are resources that look at, you know, different perspectives on how to approach the topic from different motivations.
Great, thank you for the question. Blakely or Sean, do you have any ideas for Randy?
So Randy, are you asking for resources that can help give you examples of types of questions that different communities are asking around climate change?
Exactly. Exactly.
So I can't offhand point to something specifically, but it's a great question because I don't know if that a lot of people are doing that type of work. A lot of times when people are really trying to think about the questions that people are asking, they go directly to the communities that they're working with and actually ask them those questions and do a lot of co-design of things. And so they'll ask like, what are your concerns around this topic? Like, what are you interested in? What matters to you? So a lot of that work that is around that involves people actually doing that work themselves to do that. But I would guess especially related to climate change, you'd be able to find stuff, especially in Alaska and indigenous work, where they've been looking at how it's impacting their communities.
Yeah, I can see that maybe focusing on different features of the land impact, and that would be, location specific, where, in Alaska, the rivers not being frozen over as long as, they have been in the past. So that at least points me in a direction. So thanks.
And I know that
do you have access to the chat box? Because several people have put some ideas and sources in the chat box.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and it looks like
Yeah.
Andy said something about there's a lot of research on community. So Yale actually isn't Yale that actually does a lot of work around people's attitudes towards climate change. A lot of that's kind of related to politics and whether they believe it's human influence and aspects of climate change. And that's interesting work. But there's also work like I'm familiar with, there's a scientist at UW, University of Washington, who has done work about where things like trees live has actually changed over decades because of climate. And so actually things that used to live in lower areas have actually started moving further up mountains due to climate. And there's also a mismatch sometimes between things like, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on what it is, the rabbit or hair that changes colors. So it's brown and white. And so as the climate changes, it impacts their camouflage. And I'm totally forgetting what that's called. So I apologize.
That's okay. And Randy, there are a couple of resources on PBS Learning Media that are also in the chat box that we've pointed you to. And we also have a link to the Yale work too. We have another question here that's interesting. Are there pitfalls to avoid when aiming for inclusivity?
Yes, there's a lot. And I just saw that Rachel, it looks like, put a comment in here about building trust with communities that you want to work with. So that's really essential. Relationships are really key to being able to do work well. Really building collaborative partnerships is so important. And it's really important to try and avoid essentializing communities. And so what I mean by that is just, a lot of times we end up stereotyping communities or people or we have to be really careful about the way that we demonstrate and talk about things to make sure it's not I can't think of a better way to say this, but it basically like to set it's not being oppressive to other people. And it's really representing people, like thinking about, and this is why it's important to have those relationships with people and when you're working with them, and having them as part of this process so that they are making sure that they're being represented in the way that they would like to be represented.
Great. Christopher, I hope that was helpful. Let's see. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'd like to ask a question. I don't, my last name is Chavez. I don't know if y'all could see it. And can you all hear me? Because I'm having spotty. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yes.
So looking at the model, and I really appreciate the presentation. Thank you for all the complexities added, and really identifying equity as a centering pillar for the work. As I think about the model and the work you all have done, and right now with the movement of social emotional learning, and also contextualizing when it comes to, for example, American Indian, Alaska Native communities that have a way of looking at the world, at least for my community, where we try to be in harmony with nature and not compete with it. Where in the science fields is about mastery over nature, understanding it. So as you think of the model, what of that model can you point to that accounts for some of that, if you will?
So are you asking about in our design principles, like what do we do to try and account for that?
Correct.
Yeah, so the design principles actually is, there's a whole bunch of principles in there. And so they're related to these areas about who does science, what is science, and then the access and engagement. So they're kind of centered around those categories with the anti-deficit perspective as an overarching perspective. And so as part of those design principles, hopefully what you'll see is by thinking about in the categories of like who does science, it includes thinking about like why do they do science and what are their perspectives that they bring into doing science. And so you could do things like talk about the difference between a lot of Western science really is that thing about mastering knowledge and kind of, and the way it's taught in schools is a lot about, or historically has been about kind of facts rather than the process of science. And so really understanding the process of science and how that changes over time, how theories are developed, how as we gain different ways of collecting data, analyzing data, those ideas change. And so in those design principles, hopefully what you'll see is even in those practices, we have things like thinking about like questioning what type of data you're collecting, how you're analyzing these things so that you can talk about those things like, okay, what is our perspective that we're using in these processes of science? And then also thinking about the impact on society and our communities. So thinking about, okay, if we look at these different things, how does that impact our society? Does that address your question or not?
Sorry, I have a spotty broadband here. Apologies. So yes, I can see that's the high level, and that's really important. So accounting, for example, in our communities with spirituality, can seem like in the school systems that that's religion, and it's not. It's the way we live life. So that's really what I'm trying to connect to is how do we account for that when there's at least I'm in Washington State as well, when there's a tension when we talk about spirituality and science. And with these design principles, how do we integrate that or apply it, or is that a unique individual effort? Is that a community-based effort? Does it meet the standards of Washington State? Does it cause tensions? You see what I'm asking? It's like, how do we actually do that?
So how do you take the design principles and then actually do it in your work?
Exactly. When it comes to spirituality, at least of American Indian, Alaska Native peoples, and also of Latinx communities who come from the South and have traditional ways being that don't connect to the science. So when we talk about physics, right, we talk about certain formulas and such. And then what you were saying was to contextualize it, which is really, really important.
Mhm.
And the question is, when it comes to the spirituality of praying at the sun prior to sunrise, how does that become a part of this design principle, or how can we work with it?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, is that you'll see those things built into the design principles, because there are things like talking about things like bias and perspective and whatnot in the design principles themselves. But then, as with anything, then there's that issue of taking those design principles and then using them in your own work, which is obviously challenging. And then you also brought in the issue about how does it connect to like our standards, like the next generation science standards? You know, I think these things, especially with the next generation science standards, do build on things that are in the next generation science standards. So once you look at the design principles, you'll see that we basically, as part of this, in the category of what is science, we have some things along with it, but we include the science practices that we've modified to make them into more diversity and equity practices. So they explicitly include things like looking at bias in your data and how you're collecting the data and whatnot. So they expand a little bit on those practices that are part of the next generation science standards. So I do think they are connected to NGSS. And then I wanted, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to stay on, but I wanted to just, for those of you who have to leave at 2 o'clock, and just to let you know, and JC, that's all I see of your name, Chavez, so I don't have your first name, but we will be sharing this framework, which includes the design principles, at the end of December. I say who, but I meant we. We hope to improve upon them. We consider them living documents, you know, as we move forward, and we'd love to have you review them and give us your input, and we will keep modifying them. We're not continuing on in SciAC for years 6 through 10, so we just need to figure out a way to keep in touch with all of you who are interested in this work, and we will figure that out. So for those of you who have to leave, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and attending. And oh, thank you, Juan Carlos. And we can continue to answer questions for those of you who'd like to stay. And I want to thank you, Blakely and April, for your fabulous work here, and you know, not just on the session today, but this was a tremendous year-long process, and a lot of work went into it. So kudos to you both.